Alrighty, time for another episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. So, I've been thinking long and hard about what our next conversation is. We've talked about the state of reality and a very general overview. We've talked about magic. We've talked about the Siritan Empire as well as his navy, as well as talking about the Blight Plague. And I feel like there's one thing that has come up a couple of times, and I should probably have an episode on, and that is gods. Now, within Shattered Legacies, there are beings that are classified as gods. Now, what is a god? Well, depending on who you ask, it is an ever-present, all-powerful, and all-knowing entity, sort of like the Christianity God or any other religion. Well, within Shattered Legacies, they're not quite so extravagant. They're simply beings that defy the understanding of us mortals. Basically, they're on another level. They wield abilities that we can't even begin to understand, known as divinity, and oftentimes they're in charge of entire aspects within reality. So, what is a god? Let's get super specific. What is a god? Well, a god is just a life form. It's basically humanoid in form. They oftentimes look like humans or Siritans. And they basically just walk amongst mortals. In fact, most mortal beings aren't even aware if there is a god around them unless the god actively wants mortals to know, either by utilizing or just simply emanating their divine power, or just outright running around telling people that, hey, I'm a god, which, as you can imagine, the majority of the time that doesn't really go over well. People usually look at you like you're fucking crazy, but, Now, what is divinity? Because we've talked about this before, and this is one of the core aspects of what a god is. Well, divinity is considered to be one of the 5 vital essences. Now, if you remember, we had actually talked about the 5 vital essences before. They are the power of the mind, known as psionics, the power of the body, known as physical abilities, or simply endurance or stamina, the power of the soul, which is magic, the power of being, or the power of gods, known as divinity, and finally, the power of a life, which is life force itself. And I'm pretty sure I mislabeled those, but you get the general idea. The gods believe these 5 essences, again, that being psionics, physical capabilities, magical capabilities, divinity, as well as life force itself, to be absolutely essential for something to evolve from a lesser life form into a more complex life form. We're specifically talking about complex in the sense that at the very least, it is believed that it is a being that is capable of rising or giving rise to civilizations. But we're not entirely certain, as the gods don't generally think that way, but regardless. I had also mentioned before, when we had gone over the 5 vital essences, that divinity is poisonous. It's toxic to mortal beings, and we're specifically going to go over that now because that's very important to know. That any amount of divinity beyond the bog standard amount that everybody is born with is incredibly poisonous to any mortal being. The reasoning for this is because a mortal body doesn't have the necessary, let's say, systems in order to process and refine divinity into actual abilities that they utilize. And despite that, the body will literally focus every single part of itself, even to the point where it even... So, this is a specific thing. There are certain things that your body just does without you having any conscious realization of it. For example, your heart beating, or your eyes blinking, or even breathing, which now you're all doing it manually because you're thinking about it. But anyway, magic and divinity work in a very similar way. It's automatic. But the problem is that the body not being able to process divinity, it basically refuses that idea and tries to process it anyway. So it just outright stops those automatic processes. You all of a sudden have to focus on manually breathing and all of this stuff because your body is literally shutting itself down trying to process it. And that's why it's considered to be poisonous, because the body craves divinity above all else. And as a result, your body will literally start killing itself in an attempt to find any possible means or way to process divinity. However, for gods, it's as normal as breathing when it comes to processing divinity. They do it naturally and it's not poisonous to them. However, certain doses of divinity can be lethal depending on the class of god you are. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Another important thing to know about gods is that they are immortal. And there are 3 different forms of immortality within Shattered Legacies. You have the bog standard that everybody should be aware of, which is biological immortality, otherwise known as flawed immortality within Shattered Legacies. And this is basically your body doesn't age. You can still be killed, but you won't die of old age. You aren't affected by disease or plagues or anything like that. And even with flawed immortality, even certain things such as breathing, eating, and drinking are no longer a requirement, including even sleeping. However, the majority of people that possess flawed immortality or biological immortality, they still do it more so out of habit than anything else. You know, when you're a mortal being and all of a sudden you have biological immortality, your body is still going to breathe. It's still going to want to fall asleep eventually because that's just what it does. And this is really important for beings such as the Sirritan Calamities, because each and every single one of them, we've talked about this before, how Duran is impossibly old. And this is because every single member of the Sirritan Calamities possesses biological immortality or flawed immortality. Again, they don't age. They'll never die of old age. They cannot be infected by disease, plague, or pestilence, and they don't even necessarily need to eat, drink, sleep, or breathe. However, again, those 4 they do just naturally. The problem with immortality in any form is that if you weren't born with immortality, it really fucks you up mentally. As a result, you'll notice that there are specific traits or things about each of the Sirritan Calamities that points towards them being completely and utterly insane. They may not show it, such as rambling and sitting in the corner licking the window, but they are insane in some way, shape, or form. And this is because they've lived for so long that the body simply isn't designed to live that long. And as a result, their mind kind of decays. But of course, they're immortal. They have biological immortality. So their body or their brains, their minds don't actually start deteriorating, destroying itself, like actually rotting and decaying. But their mental state and their mental faculties do start to degrade. And this is one of the reasons why, if you ever ask me what my favorite faction in Warhammer 40k is, hands down is the Necrons. Orcs are a close second, but that's not aside from the point. The reason I bring this up is because the Necrons, theoretically, as long as their bodies don't get destroyed, and even if they do, so long as they can get to a reconstruction vault in time, they'll never die. Which means that those that actually have their minds intact, this is specifically something that Traz in the Infinite had brought up, they have to find something to occupy themselves through the eons. With Traz in the Infinite, or Trazen, or however the hell his name is said, I still don't know. He became the biggest kleptomaniac of all time and just works on his gallery on Solemnes. Imatek the Stormlord, his sole purpose at this point is just the complete and utter reconquering of the entire galaxy. You need to have an objective. You need to have something that you're constantly working towards, that your mind is constantly working on. And for the Calamities, a lot of times that is simply working for the betterment of the Siritan Empire. They largely don't have overarching goals. Now, all of this being said, gods don't suffer from this. Because when a god is created, they're normally not born. When a god is created, they're created with immortality. And if a mortal is elevated to divinity via the recommendation of a god, their body and mind is oftentimes reconstructed. And as a result, they now are much more susceptible to the idea of immortality. And as a result, they don't require these hard focuses. They still have hard focuses in the form of their aspect, which we'll get to in a little bit. But, they won't slowly go mad or insane simply because they've lived for eons upon eons. Now, an important thing that we do need to talk about with gods is how gods are ranked. Because there are different ranks within the, as is officially known, the astral scale, or the divine order. Basically, this is the entirety of God, of the godhood, the kingdom of gods, shall we say. Every single god is largely ranked either on the total amount of power that they possess, or more importantly, how important their aspect is. Now, what is an aspect? Well, an aspect is basically a certain thing within reality that they have total dominion over, such as there was a god known as Angel, and he was specifically the god of timelines. He was in charge of ensuring that not just the timeline he exists in, but every feasible timeline that exists, which, to put into perspective, every single instant, we're not talking about minute, we're not talking about seconds, not milliseconds, not even nanoseconds. Every instant that passes bridges and creates a new timeline, and he was in charge of all of them. That was his job as the god of timelines. Every single god has a specific aspect that they're in charge of, and they need to ensure that it maintains proper order. Things aren't happening the way that they aren't supposed to. Now, these types of things, aspects, are largely relegated to the first two tiers of gods, and these are lesser and greater gods, as well as lesser and greater Onin. Now, we'll get to them in just a second, but we need to start at the very bottom and start working our way up. So at the very bottom, we have mortal beings, which is basically you and I, the viewer, me and the viewers. We are mortal beings. We don't have divine powers. We don't have abilities that can literally restructure reality in some cases. So we are mortal beings. After that, we have demigods, and demigods are a bit of an interesting one. They are either mortals that have been chosen as candidates to become gods eventually, or they are the result of a god and a mortal procreating, shall we say. And as a result, it creates a demigod. Now, demigods are typically very powerful. They're far more powerful than your mortal. If I had to put this into a numerical leveling system, I would say that mortals probably have a power level of 5, and this is just your average Joe. If we have bodybuilders in there and people who can actually use magic, psionics, whatever, they might reach lower 1000s. A demigod can easily reach, let's say, 150,000. They're significantly more powerful. Now, these aren't proper numbers. This is just me spitballing the idea so that you kind of get an idea of it. Demigods are significantly more powerful. After a demigod, we have lesser gods and greater gods, simply just called gods. And this is, again, where you start seeing aspects. They are in charge of a specific part of reality, and that is basically their job. That's their focus for the entirety of eternity, like with the Necrons. That's what they're doing. They're ensuring that their aspect, whatever it may be, and there are some weird ones out there, ensuring that it is properly maintained and it is functioning the way that it is supposed to. After that, after greater gods, we have lesser and greater onin. Now, that is a very difficult thing to say, but regardless, they're basically gods plus. So if we were to say that demigods are at 150,000, I would say that a god, a lesser god, is probably at 1,000,000. And then a greater god is maybe 200 million. You know, a lesser onin is close to 1,000,000,000 in terms of power. And again, just as a reminder, these aren't actual numbers. You know, this isn't a proper power scale. This is just to get you a general idea of just the sheer difference in power between each of these ranks. And again, if we're talking 1,000,000,000 for a lesser onin, it's a couple 100,000,000,000 for a greater onin. Now, this is when we stop seeing aspects and we get to the next tier of god, which is known as the omnis. And the omnis are largely in charge of universes. They're in charge of ensuring that any god that is in their universe is doing their job, you know? And it's not necessarily like a supervisor at like a factory, you know, sitting there making sure that everybody's running their machine and doing their job. It's more so they're basically like the police gods, you know? They're making sure that order is maintained. You know, if gods get into a disagreement or dispute over anything, an omni intervenes, and these guys are insanely powerful. If we're saying a couple 100,000,000,000 is a greater onin, an omni is like a couple 100,000,000,000,000. Like, we're not at the trillion level, we're at a couple 100,000,000,000,000. These guys are insanely powerful, and they kind of have to be because they have to settle the disputes. Sometimes that involves entire armies versus armies of gods. And as a result, they need to be able to put their foot down and say, this shit is not happening. Behave yourselves. You know? Now, after omnis, we have a bit of an interesting one, and that is deities. Now, for a long time, deities weren't actually a thing. When deities were first created, they were simply too powerful. They had far too much power, and as a result, it would almost drive them insane with power. And they basically just go on massive killing sprees, shall we say, and just absolutely annihilate all of the other gods. And as a result, these deities were hunted down basically to extinction. A few managed to survive, some of the weaker deities that could actually control their power, but by and large, the majority of them were hunted down. And every single time a new one would pop up, the omnis would go on basically a crusade to find this deity and deal with them before they became a problem. And eventually, the different ranks of gods noticed, hey, there's this guy next to me, and he's way fucking stronger than an omni. And I'm not quite sure why he's here, but he's here. And then the omnis would investigate. And they discovered there's fucking deities everywhere. Why aren't they going on a rampage? How has this problem remained completely unchecked? Well, it was those deities that managed to hide, that had the weaker power that they could actually control. And as a result, over time, their numbers just continued to build up and up and up. And essentially, eventually, they were recognized as an official member of the divine order. And their deities nowadays are largely in charge of entire multiverses. And again, they kind of work as police gods for omnis as well as lesser ranking gods. You know, like, it's essentially like, okay, so there's a disagreement between two gods. Let's bring out the equalizer, like a 9mm. That'll solve the problem. Oh, a 9mm isn't enough. Okay, let me bring in the fucking artillery piece. That'll solve it. I can guarantee it. You know? And again, if we're talking power levels, we said, what was it? Omnis are like a couple 100,000,000,000,000. We're easily in the quintillion. To put this into perspective, when it comes to big numbers, you have million, mono, 1, billion, bi, 2, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion at a level of 5, basically. Then a sextillion, septillion, octillion, nonillion, and decillion. And so on and so forth. It goes even further. Undecillion, dodecillion, it doesn't matter. So we're already at, what did I say, quintillions? So they're like insanely more powerful. Like omnis are on a factor of 3, and then you have deities which are at a factor of like 5. They're just ridiculous. Now, after deities, we have 2 honorific ranks. These aren't really ranks that are considered to be more powerful than deities, but they are certain ranks that are given to gods of specific noteworthiness, and that is the true god and the pure deity ranks. Now, true gods are oftentimes your bog standard god, but they're clearly far stronger than the rest of their kin, but because of their aspect, they're considered simply to be a god. At that point, they're recognized as a true god. They could be a god that has a quote-unquote lesser aspect that would be for like a lesser god, but their power level is like on par with an omni. Then they're given the rank of true god. The other one is a pure deity, and pure deities are basically that old school deity that I was talking about, the ones that go insane with their own power. It's basically deities, but they manage to control their power rather than losing complete control. But again, these are purely honorifics. They're not actual ranks within the divine order. Now, after this is the highest echelon of gods, the highest pantheon, the big head honchos themselves, and these are known as the supreme gods. And supreme gods control a major aspect of reality. Something that is considered to be absolutely vital. Like, for example, we've talked about him multiple times. Legend, or the legendary Jackson. Legend was technically a deity and a supreme god all in the same thing, because he was the deity of balance, and basically he was the equalizer between creation and destruction, which we'll get to in just a second. But he was more specifically the supreme god of creation. We have another supreme god known as Tobias, who was the supreme god of destruction. We had Dre. Dre was the supreme god of time. And then we had Mystia, later to be known as Avalon, who is the supreme god of magic. These are fundamentally important aspects to the gods. Creation and destruction are so important. Magic is one of the vital essences. Time is, for most people, an absolute necessity, and that's basically what the supreme gods are. And then again, if we're going off of a power level, if we said that deities are in the quintillions, your bog standard god is easily somewhere in the octillions. The power gap between a deity and a supreme god is just fucking ridiculous. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you could literally get the entirety of the divine order all at once, minus all of the supreme gods, and just everyone targets one supreme god. There's not a chance in hell any of them are killing them. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention in immortality is the other 2 forms of immortality. I completely forgot to bring it up. And that is incomplete immortality and complete immortality. So, incomplete immortality is basically the upgraded form of biological immortality. And this is reserved solely for gods. And it's basically, I guess it's kind of important that I did it now. So we just got done with all of the ranks. So specifically, if a being is a lesser rank tier, so let's say I am a lesser god, and you are you, the viewer, are either a demigod or a mortal. You can physically wound me. Hell, you could disembowel me, you could behead me, you could cut off my limbs. But so long as you are a lesser ranked being, you cannot directly or indirectly kill me. And gods do have abilities, whether they be psionic, magical, or divine in nature, that allow them to regenerate their bodies in these types of situations. Like I said, you can literally cut me up into tiny chunks, but I will not die. I'll still be alive, as hellish as it may be. Now, if a being is of an equal or greater rank, however, you can be killed. So that means that if I am a lesser god and you, the viewer, are a lesser god or a greater god or anything that's higher than a lesser god, you're capable of killing me. But unless you are a lesser god as well, I cannot kill you. If we're both lesser gods, then it's a fair fight. It's like two mortals fighting each other. At that point, it's whoever picks up the equalizer first, you know? The other form is known as completed immortality, and this is reserved solely for the supreme gods. Most of them, anyway. Um, Complete immortality is basically your dictionary definition of invincibility. And it even extends, oddly enough, to their own clothes. Like, you could literally throw a supreme god into the middle of a black hole, and if there was any way of perceiving into the inside of a black hole, you'd see the supreme god just standing there, right next to the singularity itself, just chilling. Not in his clothes aren't even rustling. They're just perfectly the way that they were when you threw them in, and he's just not bothered at all. Their bodies are incapable of being destroyed or even damaged, with the exception of some truly extraordinary situations. But by and large, they're completely and utterly invincible. They cannot die, again, with the exception of some truly exceptional situations, and they can't even be harmed. Now, said there was something that I need to come back to when I was talking about the different ranks, and I can't remember what the hell it was. Ah, well, whatever. I'm just going to go down my list. So, next up is, who are some important gods? Well, there's obviously a few that we've talked about already. There's Legend, the supreme god of creation. Oh, that's what it was. Creation and destruction. Okay. Put a pin in that for a second. So, gods are categorized under two categories. They're either a god of creation or they're a god of destruction. And there you could literally put equal-sized rooms, and the gods of creation would be way over capacity, and the gods of destruction, they could easily be at like comfortable social distance level. There are so few gods of destruction, but it's kind of out of necessity. Now, let's say that you have a lesser god of creation and a lesser god of destruction. Destruction is roughly 2 times stronger than creation. So despite the fact that they're the same rank, that god of, and let's say that they're actually supposed to be lesser gods. It's not because of their aspect. They're actually lesser gods. The lesser god of destruction will be like twice as strong as the lesser god of creation. But the thing is that creators and destroyers, they're not at odds with one another. Gods of creation are incredibly plentiful, but their purpose isn't just to constantly create. Their job is to maintain. They maintain their aspect the majority of the time, otherwise they are maintaining the status quo, you know? Like, basically like a material handler at like a factory or a grocery store. You know, going down the checklist, making sure that everything that is on the list is present and anything that needs to be ordered is put onto the sheet of whatever needs to be ordered. Gods of creation, Jesus, are essentially like that. You know, they constantly ensure that there are enough galaxies in this universe and this specific solar system has X amount of planets in it. It's not necessarily that specific, but it's that sort of thing. You know, they ensure that everything is where it's supposed to be. If an entire universe gets blown up, it's their job to ensure that the universe comes back. You know, that's the purpose of a creator, as well as periodically maybe just randomly doling out another universe just for shits and giggles. Now, the purpose of a destroyer is ensuring that the gods of creation stay in check, that they're not creating too many things, and anything that becomes quote-unquote anomalous or abnormal is dealt with before it can become a problem for the rest of the divine order. That's the purpose of a creator and a destroyer. And this is very important for the two characters that we're now going to go over, which is, who are some important gods? So obviously we just got done with Legend, who is the supreme god of creation, as well as Tobias, who is the supreme god of destruction. Now, each of the characters that I'm going to be going over, honestly, they probably deserve their own deep dives. Not everybody on this list is going to need one, but quite a few of them are, especially the supreme gods. Obviously, after that, we had Avalon, who is the supreme god of magic and mystery. We had Dre, who is the supreme god of creation. But we also have a few other characters. We have Astra, who is a bit of an interesting god because he doesn't just have one aspect, he has multiple aspects. He is specifically the god of the wayward soul. Basically, when somebody dies, he makes sure that their soul goes where it needs to go. You know, gods essentially have a form of like Norse Valhalla, almost, you know? And as a result, depending on what the mortal did, it's not necessarily our concept of good or evil. You know, if you murder somebody, you're clearly evil. But if you're incredibly charitable to somebody and you never hurt anybody, you're clearly good. Gods don't really have that distinction. It's more so, how did you decide to live your life in its entirety? You know, were you an utter scumbag? Okay, we're going to send you essentially to a place equivalent to Skyrim's Soul Cairn, you know? But were you somebody who was not necessarily a scumbag and was actually just a genuinely good person? All right, off to Valhalla you go, bud. You know, it's that type of situation. I can't, off the top of my head, remember what his other aspect is. He's incredibly old lore. Like, he was one of the first secondary characters I ever made. Like, again, I've been thinking this up for like 6-7 years now. So there's going to be a lot of the old lore that I just don't remember. But I do remember that he had two aspects. And I remember that one was the wayward soul. But anyway, you know, there is obviously Angel, who was originally the greater god of timelines, however, was later elevated to the supreme god of the main timeline because he lost the ability to control all timelines. And you can kind of see how these characters are important. Now, depending on who they are, they're obviously more significant than others. Obviously, Angel, before he became a supreme god, wasn't particularly an important character. Now, one thing that we are going to talk about to finish off this episode is one hell of a topic, and this is the story of Legend. Now, keep in mind, the story I'm about to give you is very much abbreviated, or not abbreviated, but very much shortened and simplified, and a lot of it is exceptionally old lore that, like, this is lore when I first started thinking up the idea of Shattered Legacies. Like, it's that old. You know, this is the beginning stuff. How, if, like, I was to make this an anime, this was originally how the anime was supposed to start. So, it was... Back then, I had so much inspiration from so many random fucking things that there are oftentimes things that I just kind of threw in there and was like, yeah, that's good. This is just purely imaginary anyway. It's not like I'm ever going to decide to talk about it on YouTube to anybody who will listen, you know, it's whatever. So, originally he was oh god, how old was he? Like, probably 15, 16-year-old. And basically, like, coming out of a small town, like the fucking starter towns in Pokemon, like Twin Leaf Town and shit like that. But, the main thing about Shattered Legacies is that it's the legacy of Legend and what he has done, as well as going beyond Legend when he finally does end up kicking the bucket for good, as well as the fact that everything is basically completely shattered. The concept of time and reality at that specific time when the show was originally created was completely and utterly fucked because of an event that was constantly and forever replaying, because There was just no way to solve the issue. So they would basically just revert the timeline, and wait until some new thing comes in that just may or may not be the answer to the problem that they had. But regardless, so at the very beginning, it was this really weird, bizarre situation, like the village guards of the town that legend originally came from, they were clearly in like medieval armor, like full plate armor, but they had guns on them because time was just completely out of whack, and nobody really thought this as weird. Medieval armor but modern weapons. Some areas are so lacking in technological advancements that they're essentially in the medieval or Renaissance era, whereas literally just like 2 blocks down you have like modern era times, where people have like cell phones and TVs and computers and shit, and nobody thought that this was weird because it's just how it was. That's just how reality is. And so we are introduced by legend going to the next town over, and I can't for the life of me remember what the name was. Keep in mind, the majority of this information is retconned nowadays. It's not the old lore anymore, but I'm going to go over it simply because I kind of want to. And so legend ended up coming across this next village or town over, and he had noticed that there was a giant outcrop, kind of like Pride Rock from Lion King. Obviously not a rip, but like an outcrop that's clearly a cliffside that is jutting outwards, kind of like how Pride Rock is, where they stand up there and do their little announcements, and he had noticed that there was somebody up there. And so, legend being legend, he was like, oh, that guy clearly wants company. Just started walking up to the person. And then when he finally got up to the top, he noticed that the person was gone. But there was literally no way that they could have disappeared without legend physically seeing them going past. And he was like, well, that's a little weird, and went back down and went into the town and told the townspeople of what he saw. And people were like, oh, yeah, that must be a guy known as Jack. He has some weird thing going on, and nobody's quite sure what the hell is happening with him. Turns out he was a test subject from a project known as the Osiris Project. And the Osiris Project was basically, it was the precursor to the Cyrus Project. Now, the Osiris Project was working on 4 different individuals, whereas the Cyrus Project was when humans tried to create that artificial magic and ended up creating the Ciritans. That's an important distinction. 1 letter difference. But regardless, the Osiris Project was basically the precursor. It was the trial phase. And so legend kind of got the idea of what was going on, and he decided to go back up there because legend being legend just can't drop the topic, can't drop the situation, and basically went up there and said, Jack, I know that you're up here. And it turns out that Jack had the unique and rather interesting ability to turn completely and utterly invisible whenever the hell he wanted, and sometimes when he didn't want to. And so basically they got to talking, and Zach, which is going to get real confusing, Zach and Jack, yeah, I know. Legend had ended up learning about the Osiris Project, and specifically that some really bad shit had gone down there. Now, there is a specific entity that is a major fucking problem within Shattered Legacy's old lore, especially early on, and it was known as the Molag. And the Molag was basically, what the fuck was his name? Omamu, I think, from Doctor Strange, the weird, like, fucking space cloud entity thing. It's kind of similar to that thing, right at the end of Doctor Strange. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, sorry. But, the Molag is similar to whatever the hell that thing was, And basically, it was just the incarnation of a very special disease known as malice. Now, there are two forms of malice within Shattered Legacies. There's obviously the standard malice that we're aware of, malicious intentions, but there's also a disease known as malice. And it's basically like hyper rabies. You become uncontrollably, irresistibly hyper aggressive to the point where you will do absolutely anything to kill everything around you. And basically, they took the Moloch and they refined some of his body down into this horrific molasses consistency, black inky sludge looking stuff that you just look at it and your immediate reaction is like, yeah, I should have that nowhere fucking near my body, let alone being injected into my body. But for some fucking reason they did it. And Jack's abilities was a result of this process. However, it essentially slowly corrupted his body, especially when he wasn't in the facility that he had been experimented on, because basically shit went sideways and a containment breach occurred, and like the entire facility is now completely coated in this corrupting malice. And it doesn't have a physical form, it's not like a puddle of that black inky sludge on the ground. It's literally a disease, but it's capable of even infecting the air around you and almost having like a heavy sensation. However, when it's in the air, you can't be infected by it, but it almost creates this sort of like not mirage, what the fuck word. It basically creates like this haze in the air, and that is kind of has a chance to infect you. I don't know, like I said, it's really old lore. But so he ended up going there, and they ended up deciding that they were going to investigate this place. Jack just needed to go back because the pain that he was starting to suffer from not being around all of this airborne malice was just starting to get to be too much. He needed to be in it, in order to start soothing all of that pain. And Legend, being Legend, was just curious by nature and wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. And so he went deep inside of the facility, which is probably the stupidest fucking idea you could possibly have, and ended up finding some clipboards that had OC-1 through OC-4. In case you couldn't guess, that's Osiris. Or I think the original letters was OCP-1 through 4, which is Osiris Project. But basically, he found this, and then immediately after, there was some movement in the chamber. And this immediately got his attention, and he started slowly making his way back towards Jack. Why? I'm not entirely certain, because the dude can literally just turn invisible. That's not particularly helpful to him. But he, for whatever reason, decided it's better if I'm next to this guy who at least knows what the fuck is going on. And so this ends up becoming a chase situation. Legend is quite literally running like a bat out of hell through the corridors, desperately trying to find the main entrance, while whatever the fuck is chasing him is literally right on his heels. And it's pitch black in there. Why he didn't bring a flashlight or some form of light, I will never understand, because again, it was old lore. But basically, whenever he looked behind him, it was utterly pitch black, but there was this just slightly denser black in the shape of a humanoid form. But more specifically, he could see that there was an even further denser black. We're talking like pitch black to Vanta black to whatever the fuck the upgraded version of Vanta black is. I can't remember what the fuck it's called, but you kind of get what I mean. And it was this almost like smoky haze right behind the head of whatever was chasing him. And so he ends up getting to the main entrance, and Jack kind of caught whiff of what was going on and was already standing outside of the building because he's a little shithead that just basically abandoned Legend. And right as Legend is about to get out, he notices that the ceiling right above the entrance, which keep in mind the entire facility is underground, but he notices that the ceiling right above the entrance is all of a sudden has an ever so slight, almost bioluminescent pink glow. And this is specifically what psionics used to look like. You know, before it was like a pink color that would just all of a sudden envelop something, and that was, something was under the influence of psionics. And basically, the roof collapsed inwards. And Legend, being Legend and not fully understanding what was going on, but certainly capable of fighting to protect himself, essentially uses the magic that he could use back then, which wasn't anything particularly impressive. It was basically just golden energy that enveloped his hand into a form of like sword tip looking thing. Kind of like the energy blade that the Protoss use in StarCraft, similar to that. And it completely enveloped his hand. It was completely gold. It was called the Golden Sword. Really original. I know, it's old lore. Leave me alone. And so basically fought this thing until finally he noticed that at some point during the fight, that like super dense black smoke thing was all of a sudden gone from behind the head of this creature, whatever the hell it was. And so he kind of just stops because he has a feeling that that's kind of what was making this thing aggressive. And it turns out he was right. The entity, which he still cannot properly see, ends up identifying itself as Jen. And it basically says, thank you for assisting me. That thing had control over me. I'll kind of tell you what the hell is going on, but first let's get the hell out of here. And at that point, basically, the entire ceiling and the entire ground above the facility all of a sudden turns into perfect hexagonal cylinders that just literally raise out above the ground, and they just calmly walk out. And then they just go straight perfectly back into place, and it's like nothing even affected them. And he sees that the being in front of him appears to be human. However, there's almost like a holographic flicker across their body every once in a blue moon. He's not quite sure what the hell that's on about or what that's all about, but he's like, fuck it, they didn't kill me, I don't care. So a bunch of shit happens. This episode's already gotten on long enough. I need to cut it down at some point. Bunch of shit happens, and they ended up finding out who the other members of the Osiris Project was. It was an individual, a woman known as Vicky, as well as Jen and Jack. And the CP03, or OC... What the fuck was it? OCP-3, that's what it was, Osiris Project, I gotta remember that sometimes, turned out to be an utterly bizarre creature known as an ethereal. Now, we haven't talked about the ethereals before, but we will have a deep dive on them. Suffice to say, they're fucking horrifying. Like, mortals, it's like, you could literally be staring up at Duran, who's literally about to turn you into a puddle of magma on the floor, and like fighting Duran at that moment would be preferable to encountering an ethereal. They're just horrifying. But so, see, Osiris Project test subject number 3 was an ethereal, and it turns out that whatever the fuck they refined the Molag's body into was like basically like fucking steroids to the ethereal. It just made it insanely powerful and ended up completely and utterly corrupting Vicky. Now, the important thing is that we now get to something that gods have access to, and they're known as creation engines. And this is an incredibly dangerous type of technology that was originally created back during the Origin War. You remember how I said that there was a species known as the Orotan, which were mistakenly translated as the Origin race? And there was a war between two individuals, the original Zach Jackson as well as an individual known as Zara. Yeah, creation engines were made back then, and they're basically, it's basically a frame. Like, think in city centers, sometimes people will create art that is just out of completely random things. Like, I think somewhere nearby where I live, there's literally a sculpture of a peacock made out of forks. I'm not lying. I think that's still there, unless it got replaced. It might have gotten replaced. But anyway, like sculptures like that. it's basically incredibly fancy and elaborate looking. It's plated in solid gold, but it doesn't have any mechanisms. It doesn't have any machines in it. It's completely hollow and completely see-through through the um it's like branches of a tree, you know? Like you're going down a path and there's trees on either side, but there's almost like this archway as the tree branches grow up and around and kind of intermingle at the top point, and then it's just like this mesh of tree limbs. It's that sort of thing, you know? It's multiple different tendrils interwoven to look incredibly elaborate and beautiful, but there's no obvious machinery or mechanism behind what it does. And basically, there is a keyhole for a key. Ironically enough, the gods created a key. And once you put it in there, it will grant. It's basically a genie. Like, it's a genie in a bottle or a lamp or whatever the fuck. But, like, on super steroids, it can grant literally anything. It's a one-time use, and it's not like the Dragon Balls from Dragon Ball Z, you know? You make your wish, and then the Dragon Balls, like, go up in the air and shoot out in different directions, and now you gotta find them again after however many years long of a wait it is, or whatever the fuck, you know? It's not like that. It's literally, you get your wish, you ask your wish, it is granted, the machine shuts down, and then you can just put the key back in, activate it again, and request another wish. So as you can imagine, this thing is incredibly fucking dangerous. Like, seriously. And it's capable of doing anything. It can literally turn a mortal into a supreme god with one wish. Now, there is a caveat, and that is that it doesn't understand consequences. So, like, there was, I can't remember what cartoon it was. I know that it was a, like, Halloween, it might have been The Simpsons. But basically, somebody, I think it was a Monkey Paw episode, and I think it was The Simpsons or maybe something else. But somebody had the monkey paw, and they basically said, I wish to be a star, like a celebrity. And it was literally like, I shall grant your wish, and the finger curled, and the, like, I think it was a little girl literally shot into fucking space and turned into a star. And it was like, holy shit. But, you know, it's that type of situation. It won't necessarily take things that literally, but it doesn't understand the consequences of such choices. So, like, if you decide, if your wish is, I want to become a supreme god, it will make you a supreme god, but it won't reform your body to be able to withstand the divine power of a supreme god, and thus your body will now have access to the level of divinity that a supreme god has. And we all know what happens when mortals have access to divinity. The body literally kills itself trying to refine this stuff. So you have to be either super specific or ask for things that won't get you killed, because that definitely will get you killed. And so basically, the gods understood how dangerous these things were, and they tried to destroy them. However, they eventually found out that creation engines were directly connected to the universe that it inhabited. Like, every single universe has one creation engine, and if you break it, it completely shatters the universe. Like, like the universe is a pane of glass, and you just throw a fucking rock through it. It shatters the universe. And so basically they end up doing this huge, basically back and forth war of trying to prevent the Ethereal and Vicky to do whatever the hell they planned to do with the creation engine. And they ended up stopping them. So really, long story short, eventually Legend starts to decide that he wants to become a god. But in order to become a god, if you're immortal, you have to have a god that is like, okay, I recognize you as a mortal that is worthy of becoming a god. You will eventually become a god. Your body will be able to convert divinity. And your mind and your body will eventually be reformed and reforged to the standards of a god, so that you don't go insane or you don't have any of the negative physical side effects of a mortal with the power of a god. Legend didn't have any of that. So under normal circumstances for that type of situation, he just wouldn't become a god. It's completely impossible unless you have the approval of a god, which Legend never got. But Legend's always been kind of anomalous, and it's definitely gotten him in trouble with destroyer gods in a number of times in the past, specifically when he first met Tobias. Tobias was like, "You're fucking unnatural. I need to deal with you," and basically fought to a standstill. But he basically forced himself to become a god. And this majorly fucked him up because he ended up going not just demigod, not just lesser or greater god. He went to the fucking head honchos themselves, the supreme gods, which at the time didn't even exist. In fact, Legend was the first supreme god. When he attained the power of a supreme god is when the cast was originally created. But basically, his body was reforged into that of a god so it could handle it, but his mind never was. Meaning, all the way up until the point in the lore when he died for good, his mind was completely mortal. And as a result, the dude was fucking batshit crazy insane. But so, there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of lore around Legend. But you kind of get the general idea of where he came from. We will be doing a dedicated deep dive on Legend at some point, but I just kind of wanted to throw it in there because the episode was going to be short and I wanted something to fill the time with. But basically, Legend fought all the way up to the point where he became a supreme god, completely and utterly insane at that point. But, so yeah. There was absolutely no reason for me to put that old lore in there, and there's a lot more old lore that I could go over, but this video is probably already way over time, so. Plus, it's already late at night, and I kind of want to go to bed, so we're going to call it there. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys are looking forward to the next Shattered Legacies deep dive, where we're probably going to be talking about another major faction, probably the Demon Legions. I'm not going to lie, I've been kind of wanting to go over the Demon Legions recently. We might be doing the Demon Legions. And that one is definitely going to be a long one because it's going to basically be micro deep dives of every single member of the Demon Legion, simply because each individual member doesn't have enough lore for their own dedicated deep dive episode. But so I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I hope that you guys are also looking forward to tomorrow, i.e. Wednesday's 7 Days to Die episode, as well as Fridays and Sundays RimWorld live stream at noon Central Standard Time on the YouTube channel. And I haven't been plugging this recently, but I need to start doing it. There is also a community Discord where you can come on, you can chat with me. I haven't done them in a while. In fact, I completely have been forgetting to do it. But there is a perk that I need to start doing again, known as Sneak Peek, where basically I will go into one of the Discord voice chats and start live streaming, and you get to see the episodes whilst they're being created. And that means that you don't have to wait for the next Saturday or the next Monday or the next Friday episodes or the next Tuesday or whatever the hell it is that you guys are looking for. So you can join that. Not only that, but every once in a blue moon, I decide to do a private Discord-only live stream. Again, within one of the voice chats, I start live streaming. If you have a game, if you have the same game as what I'm playing, you're more than welcome to join. And even if you don't, everybody is welcome to join into the voice chat and just generally talk and chat with me, you know? I'm available pretty much 24/7 on Discord. Like, the only time I'm not really available is if I'm super busy at work or I'm actually asleep. So, you know, if you ever wanted to talk to me, which I'm not that great of a guy to begin with, but if you ever wanted to, that's available to you. We have a community Discord. I'm going to try and remember to put it in the description of videos from now on, but for a fact, it is in the channel description. So if you go to my channel, in the channel description directly below my name, there is a link to the community Discord, which should theoretically still work. I don't know if it still works. It should still work. I think I set it to infinite. But regardless, if it doesn't, send a comment in a video saying, hey, the Discord link doesn't work. Can we get a new one? And I will happily set you guys up with that. So, again, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys later. See you guys.